So Morty Smith, the second half of Rick and Morty and the second most important character in the entire show, has a hell of a lot of different versions and variants scattered all across the entire multiverse. And in the entire 8 seasons of the show that we have seen so far, we have actually gotten to see over 100 different versions of him. And with that fact in mind, I've decided to go through and pick out and explain every single one of them, which if you've looked at the length of this video actually took quite a long time to do. So with that said, and without wasting any more time, let's just quickly begin with Prime Morty, the baseline basic Morty that is about as bland and as boring as they possibly get. So Morty Smith from the Prime Dimension is often incorrectly identified as Morty C-137, that is at least all the way up to much later in Season 5. Now overall, like I just said, he's extremely basic in personality and design, being that he's just the standard yellow shirt wearing, scared anxious kid that we all know and honestly just kinda tolerate for the sake of the show. Now for the most part, Morty Prime just spends a great deal of his time travelling across the multiverse with who he once believed to be his grandfather Rick. However, in the episode Solo Ricks, it was revealed that Rick was actually Rick C-137. Now this of course didn't change anything for Morty Prime, and to this day he still travels around and considers Rick C-137 to be his grandfather. This is largely due to that Rick being the only Rick that he has ever truly known. Now as for his intelligence and abilities, well, he actually has the incredibly weird ability to transform into a boat. That is, if he focuses hard enough and finds the right spot on his body to hit. This was of course due to the implant that was given to him by Rick sometime around Season 2. But now due to him actually being related to Rick Prime and his ability to rapidly think, Morty Prime is actually considered by many to be highly intelligent, and in fact is considered to be one of the smartest Mortys in existence. But now moving on, up next we have everyone's favourite Morty, Evil Morty, or as many others like to refer to him as, the Morty who has just stopped giving a fuck. Now Evil Morty was first introduced in the episode Close Rick Encounters of the Rick Kind, and is in fact the most unique and rebellious version of Morty that we have ever seen. He's cold, strategic, and highly intelligent. He rejects the systematic dominance of Ricks across the entire multiverse and seeks to destroy the entire central finite curve, which is essentially a construct that confines the multiverse to realities where Ricks are always the smartest and the ones in control. By breaking it, Evil Morty aimed to access universes that were free from Rick's supremacy. Now towards the end of Evil Morty's adventures, or what we have seen so far up to this point, he actually finally does and achieves what he actually wants, and escapes the central finite curve, and from what we can gather actually travels to a Rickless reality where he currently remains to this day. Now quickly moving on, when explaining and breaking down Evil Morty, there's another Morty that just has to be mentioned shortly after, and that's of course Campaign Manager Morty, the guy who potentially played one of the most crucial roles in Evil Morty's rise to presidential and political power. For you see, Campaign Morty and the presidential campaign itself was this brilliant chess move from Evil Morty, that of course allowed Evil Morty to disguise himself as another innocent person and someone who you'd never expect or associate with evil deeds. But that's not all, as Campaign Morty was also one of the only people who ever discovered the truth about Evil Morty. However, by the time that he was able to get to Evil Morty, he had already rose to presidential power and was borderline untouchable, which of course meant Campaign Morty was quickly dealt with and flushed into the vacuum of space, marking the end of one of the most underrated Mortys of all time, and personally one of my favourites. But now moving on, let's just quickly break down Hammerhead Morty, another variant that fans have always loved. Now as you might have guessed from the name, Hammerhead Morty is a Morty with a hammer's head in place of his own, and with his cylinder-like body shape, it's fair to assume that his whole body is that of an actual hammer. But now, although it is never clearly stated in the series, many have come to believe, based on the bio in Pocket Mortys, that he didn't start out his life as a hammer, but rather was turned into one during one of Rick's many experiments. But now aside from that, he is exactly like all other Mortys, timid in personality and scared of just about everything, including his own shadow. So now with that said, and without wasting too much time on him, let's just jump over to Police Officer Morty. Now Police Officer Morty was an alternate version of Morty Smith who appeared in the episode The Ricklantis Mix-Up, where he was basically revealed to be a police officer in charge of the Citadel's protection. Now he's an obese Morty with a double chin and lazy eye bags. He wears the standard Citadel cop uniform and has an expression of disdain and contempt. He's abusive in personality and incredibly jaded from the chaos and destruction that currently populates the Citadel. He totally dismisses any idea of acting in accordance to protocol and instead prefers to insult, strong-arm and manipulate his way into achieving the outcomes that he desires. And what's more is he is often willing to threaten and even murder in order to avoid the formalities of a fair trial. He's a complete dick and someone that, at least to me, stands out as the most corrupt and evil Morty of them all. Now while we seem to be on this evil alternate Morty run, let's cover Night Morty, another evil version of Morty Smith from the episode Night Family. Now in this episode, Rick makes a machine that allows the family to stay awake and work throughout the night. Only Night Summer eventually takes over and corrupts the other family members into doing her bidding, including Night Morty, who at this point aids evil Night Summer in her goals of complete daytime takeover. Now after some resistance from Rick, who completely refuses to thank them for their efforts during the night, they do actually manage to take complete control over the entire daytime. And in fact, to this day, it is still widely believed that the Smith family of that reality hold complete control of that reality itself. Moving on, next on our list is Morty, also known as Bushworld Adventures Morty. Now Morty exists as an Australian counterpart to Morty Smith, and was seen in the 11-minute special episode that aired unannounced on Adult Swim on April 1st, 2018. The episode itself was called Bushworld Adventures. Now Morty is almost identical to our Morty in almost every way, aside from the obvious differences of his accent and the way he is drawn. But aside from that, he's still the same kid Rick forces to come along on his many weird adventures. Moving on, next we have Cronenberg Morty from the episode Rick Potion number 9. Now it's at the end of the episode itself that we actually see Cronenberg Morty and Cronenberg Rick, who have actually just travelled through a portal to the Cronenberg world. However, unlike the others that are currently roaming around that world, they are actually capable of human speech. This is likely due to them being an aftermath result of one of Rick's failed experiments. Now from what we can gather so far, it is actually believed that they still remain somewhere within that world. Although given that it is still a version of Rick, it is highly likely that they are currently travelling across the multiverse as we speak. Moving on, up next we have Genius Morty, or as some like to call him, Tall Morty. Now Tall Morty is a version of Morty Smith that is actually the smart one between the duo, with Rick of course being the one to wear the yellow shirt and existing in place of what the regular Morty would be to the genius of Rick. However, after being mocked and made fun of over and over again by the Genius Morty, Yellow Shirt Rick grabs hold of a hammer and actually bashes in Genius Morty's head, shocking both our Rick and Morty and killing what is actually one of the very few smart Mortys that we have actually ever seen in the entire multiverse. Now with that said, let's move on to Morty Smith 304-X, also known as Dictator Morty from issue 7 of the comics. Now this Morty is a Morty Smith who has become mad with power and has actually risen and taken complete control over the entire world, becoming an oppressive dictator who kills anyone who acts against him. Now after a fight against our Morty and our Rick, we actually see him begin to have a change of heart. However, this wouldn't actually amount to much, as in the end and shortly after having this change of heart, he is actually crushed to death by his own stepdad, Jerry, when he of course enters in a huge armoured vehicle. Which I can't lie was actually an incredibly shitty way for one of the coolest Mortys of all time to actually be killed off. But now speaking of fascist dictators, let's talk about Fascist Morty of the fascist dystopian universe. Now he was basically a small dick having unconfident Morty, who threatened to shoot Rick every time he wanted to do something that Morty of course didn't. Now of course this wouldn't fly for long, and Rick eventually took charge of the situation and had him killed by Mr. Meeseeks. This happened when the gun went off in the ship that broke the glass and sent them all into the vacuum of space, where they of course suffocated. Which honestly was quite a fitting death for Nazi Morty to have. But now while on the topic of fascism, let's talk about fascism fighting Morty from issue 29 of the comics. Now this version of Morty basically spent his entire time traveling across the multiverse with his Hitler measuring gun to fight fascism, killing anyone who measured high enough on the meter. Now along the way he'd run into his prime counterpart doing the exact same thing. They both scan each other and prepare to shoot. But right then Rick C-137 shot him in the head, killing them so that they could of course move on with their adventure. And just like them, we're going to do the exact same thing and move right along to Gluttonspiel Morty from the episode Morty Publicity. Now he's basically one of the many Morty Smith decoys that we of course see in this episode, and the one who aided Gluttonspiel Beth in creating a peaceful community for the decoys to reside. However, after the betrayal of his dad Gluttonspiel Jerry over some varnish, he along with the many other decoys in that community were actually killed off by the squids. Although things wouldn't actually be that much better for Gluttonspiel Jerry, who actually managed to survive, as he would actually go on to suffer more than any other character in existence. Moving on, next up we have Adult Morty from the episode Rick Morty Jack. Now this Morty is around 26 years old, and although his appearance is brief, it's still quite a powerful one in terms of what it represents for Mortys in the show, as this version of Morty is shown to be older, hardened, independent, and emotionally detached, representing a possible future for our Morty to take if he continued down Rick's path of corruption and absence. Again, it's just a brief appearance, but here he is, so let's just mention him. Next up, we have Alien Morty, who appeared in the episode Close Rick Encounters of the Rick Kind. Now this Morty, as you might have guessed from the name, is a Morty Smith that looks like an alien. He's slim, green, and has 2 curly antennas on top of his head, as well as 3 eyes and 4 arms. And just like Adult Morty, is someone that we only see for a few seconds and never really again after. And up next, we have another of the same Mortys seen in the same exact episode, Antenna Morty. Now again, as you might have guessed, this is basically a Morty with 2 green antennas sitting on top of his head, making him look almost alien. He was a slave to evil Rick and Morty before ultimately teaming up with the other Mortys to take down Rick and his crab soldiers. Oh, and he's also apparently someone who dreams of one day writing a really crazy, intense action novel which he can then sell, which I guess does kind of make him unique in some shit kind of way. But now moving on, up next we have Psychopath Morty, which is another briefly seen Morty in the episode Rick Lantis Mix-Up. This Morty is a Morty that pretends to be sad in order to trick police officer Rick into dropping his guard, so that he could then try to stab and kill him. However, before he could get the chance to kill that Rick, he was shot by Cop Morty in the chest, which of course killed him. Next up we have the briefly seen Aqua Morty, which is a Morty Smith that seems to be combined with some sort of fish. He's only ever really seen in the Citadel with his Rick and has never really played an important role in any other episode except for this one. But now speaking of that episode and the Citadel of Ricks, inside we can also see Artist Morty, Big Head Morty, Cyclops Morty, Long Sleeve Morty, Blue Shirt Morty, Cowboy Morty, Toy Morty, Robot Morty, and what appears to be a Citadel officer Morty. Now along the way and later in the same episode, we also get to see a lot more random Mortys getting tortured outside the hideout of Evil Morty, as well as more random Mortys being held prisoner inside. Now this is all before we then move over to the house where we see Eric Stoltz Mask Morty, who's basically the Morty to Doofus Rick. Now back at the prison we actually meet the Worshipper Mortys, which are basically a group of Mortys who worship and await the return of the one true Morty, who is basically the god version of Morty, who many actually subsequently believe to be Morty Prime. But now in the episode The Rickshank Redemption, like mentioned earlier, we actually see a lot more Mortys in the same Citadel, with Maple and Dipper Morty being some of the first seen in this scene. But we then move over to our Morty and Summer on trial at the Citadel, where we then meet what is said to be a lawyer version of Morty. But he's not really a lawyer and just more of a Morty that they keep around to laugh at. But now moving on, next we have both an afro and a bald version of Morty seen in issue 36 of the comics. Here, Afro Morty arrives at a local barbershop to get a haircut from Barber Rick. Bald Morty then steals his phone to go and check out his version of Jessica. Following this, Barber Rick finds out and feeds him to a random creature living in his basement, marking one of the quickest Morty appearances and deaths in all of Rick and Morty. Now next we then jump back to the Rick Lantis Mix-Up episode to finish off explaining the last of the remaining Mortys seen within that episode, starting with Rick and Morty K22, who shows up looking for money to rebuild the Citadel of Ricks. We then see a squid-faced Morty in the background of this scene before moving over to the Academy of Mortys, where we see pretty much the same exact Morty just 6 or 7 times. We then see Evil Morty once again at the Hospital of Mortys, where we also see an Elephant Trunk Morty and a crystallized version of Morty Smith. We then see a couple of more Mortys when he's doing his campaign, with Stripy Hair Morty, Orange Alien Morty, and Short Shirt Morty being some of the most random of the currently seen Mortys. We then go back to the Academy of Mortys, where we see a Glasses Wearing Morty, a Slick Haircut Morty, a Fat Morty, otherwise known as Left-Handed Morty, and a weird lizard experiment failure version of Morty Smith. There's also this retarded Rick that is also referred to as Tall Morty, but to me he's just a retarded Rick in a yellow shirt. Moving on, next we have a couple of good-for-nothing Mortys selling some sort of drugs on the streets of the Citadel. We also see a bunch of homeless Mortys scattered all around, before we then move over to both a shopkeeper Morty and a Morty with a weird purple snout. Now later in the same episode we see a bartender version of Morty, which if you couldn't have guessed, is a Morty who works behind the bar. Next we see a few crackhead versions of Morty with tattoos on their faces. These Mortys are also known as the Morty Town Locos. We then go back to the club where we see a lot more unique Mortys. We see a cowboy version of Morty, a builder's hat Morty, and some sort of gay Morty. But that's not all, as we also see a blue shirt Morty, a waiter Morty, a Dan Gutterman Morty, Van Holtz Morty, who is also known as Beard Morty, Short Shorts Morty, 2D Morty, and this random as fuck Morty that honestly I don't even have a name for. We then see a Morty with a flower in his hair, as well as 2 bouncer Mortys that are incredibly jacked. There are also 2 bouncer Mortys that are currently protecting and watching over Big Morty, who is essentially a criminal kingpin who bribes the local police force. Now finally we have post-Atlantis Morty seen at the end of the episode. Moving on, up next we have Freckled Morty from issue 23, which is of course just a Morty with freckles on his face. Nothing more, nothing less. Up next, it's Giant Butt Eating Morty from issue 33 of the comics, which is an incredibly fucking weird Morty. He's basically a giant version of Morty who eats by inserting things up his ass. Like, does it get any weirder than that? Even for Rick and Morty standards? But now up next, we have Mechanical Morty, which is a robot copy of Morty built by Rick to trick Beth into thinking her family is still around, when they are actually in fact in some post-apocalyptic dimension. Oh, and there's also this mechanical version of Morty seen within the Fortnite video game. The two aren't exactly related by any means, other than the fact that their names are very similar, being that they're both called Mechanical Morty. Moving on, next we have another tall version of Morty, also known as Morty Rick. He's basically a version of Morty that dresses exactly like Rick and is presumed to be as smart as him. But as of right now, that is entirely speculation by the entire fanbase. Now in the Planetina episode, we also see Morty dress up and pretend to be a pizza delivery boy. And while this to me is just the regular Morty in some sort of outfit, he has been given a name known as Pizza Delivery Morty. So I guess he does deserve mentioning, at least in this video. But now it's not just him, as we also have SOS Morty from the Fat of Acid episode, which is honestly one of my favorite episodes. He's basically just our Morty who has survived the plane crash. But for some unknown reason, he has also been given an alternative name, aka SOS Morty, like we previously mentioned. It's redundant in my opinion, but hey, here he is, so let's just leave it at that and move on. Up next, we have Rodent Morty from issue 23 of the comics. And again, this is a version of Morty from a dimension populated by humanoid rodents, which is kinda cool I guess, and something that may get an episode in the future, who knows. Quickly moving on, up next we have Scarecrow Morty from the Mortypolicity episode. A Morty that is completely made out of straw and other various Scarecrow parts. And in my opinion, honestly, pretty much the ugliest Morty in existence. But now moving on, next we have another fascist version of Morty known as Shrimp Morty, which is actually a Morty seen in the same episode as the previously mentioned Nazi Morty. He's basically a Morty from the shrimp dimension and one that looks exactly like a shrimp. He can climb walls and collect Nazi memorabilia. That's about it. Moving on, up next we have Space Jam Morty from the cameo appearance seen in the Space Jam movie. A cameo that has also been credited as the time Rick and Morty completely sold out. Up next we have a Spaceman Morty from the Rick and Morty anime. It's a Morty in an orange spacesuit in space. That's about it. Moving on, up next we have Future Simulation Morty from the 241st. He appeared in the episode Never Ricking Morty and was basically a simulated Morty who wanted to kill Rick and prove that nothing was real and everything was a simulation. I know, incredibly weird, but hey, that's Rick and Morty for you. A show where normal is weird and weird is normal. And in fact, if it makes sense, it's probably just a bad episode of Rick and Morty. But now moving on, up next we have Story Train Morty, which is a Morty that we followed through a simulated story adventure in the episode that we just previously mentioned. He had no clue he was a simulated Morty until the very end of the adventure, when Rick in fact discovered that the entire train wasn't real and everything around them was in fact just something that Morty bought at some gift shop in the Citadel. Next up, we have Toxic Morty, which is a Morty that came into being after a stressed out Rick and Morty went to some alien day spa, where all their toxicity and negative emotions were removed from their bodies. Now come the end of the episode, they did re-merge with one another, but he did exist, so he's also worth explaining. Next on our list, it's Turkey Soldier Morty from Season 5, Episode 6, a Thanksgiving special episode where Rick, Morty, and the President of the United States fights to save the entire world from an evil turkey president and his army of turkey soldiers. An episode I still consider one of the weirdest and kinda shittest of all time. Up next we have Wasp Morty, which is a Morty Smith that stems from the Wasp dimension, which is a dimension where everyone and everything appears to be some wasp-like person. Next up, it's Morty Smith 9-2184C, or as he is otherwise known, Confident Morty from issue 22 of the comics. Now this is a version of Morty from a dimension that is described by Rick to be full of self-assured assholes. He was brought into our world by Rick to help Morty flirt with Jessica. But given his self-assured asshole behavior, he actually only went on to make things a hell of a lot worse for our Morty in the end. Up next, it's Morty C-1.21, which is basically the live-action Morty played by Jaden Martell, which in my opinion is also an incredibly great casting for the live-action version of Morty Smith, and someone I actually do think is perfect for the role if they consider to do it again. Up next, we have Morty Smith C-131, which is the Morty that was actually killed and replaced by our Rick and Morty in episode 6 of season 1. Up next, we have Morty Smith C-290, who is basically this 70s looking Morty who was taken captive by evil Morty in that random episode way back when. Up next, it's Morty Smith from the Parmesan Dimension, which again is a dimension the Smith family once went to and took over when they managed to fuck up and destroy their previous one. Moving on, in the episode of Mort Well Lived from season 6, we see Morty's mind get split into multiple video game characters who are all essentially the same version of him. So to just save us some time so we don't have to go through every single one of them, just take this minor explanation about that episode as the explanation for each and every one of them. They are all essentially variants of Morty's mind, and all essentially variants of Morty. Moving on, in episode 1 of season 8, we see an adult Morty inside the simulated reality surviving out in the woods. He looks incredibly wild and stressed, and in the past apparently was a firefighter and a soldier who lost his close friend, giving him incredible PTSD. Now later in episode 3 of season 8, we see a planet full of Morty clones, with the first scene being Arcade Morty, who's a Morty with an incredibly shit haircut. Now later he shows up again alongside a fake doctor version of Morty with a shit hat and glasses. Now down the line and later in that same episode, we see a mine worker Morty, a straw hat wearing Morty, and a Morty in a skull helmet. And also some sort of waiter version of Morty in a red vest. Now later in this scene, we also see an old fashioned version of Morty in a shit hat alongside his Rick. Now at the end of this episode, Rick actually creates one of the ugliest and most powerful Morty clones of all time, which I coined to the name of Monster Morty. But if you've got a better one, please let me know down below. But now of course there are an infinite amount of Mortys that still exist out there in the entire multiverse. But for now that does it for every single Morty seen all the way up to season 8 episode 7, which as of the making of this video is the most current released episode on Adult Swim. So with that said, I do hope each and every one of you enjoyed, even if it was just a little bit, and consider subscribing for a bit more. But for now, in case I don't see ya, good afternoon, good evening, and good night.